Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim, resident fellow with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I recently sat down with Ryan Smith, who currently serves as the Chief External Officer of the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools in the Los Angeles Unified School District. Previously served as the Executive Director of the Education Trust West and as a Vice President of Education Trust National. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Ryan, tell us a little bit about some of the work that you're currently doing in Los Angeles. I know you recently started your new role. It's great to be back home, I would imagine. So what's some of the work that you're doing with the the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools?
Yeah, so after spending the last 5 years thinking about ways that we can change the system and doing a lot of research on ways we can change the system, it feels good to be working within an organization and a school district and actually implementing some of those ideas. So my role is to lead a series of teams working in 3 communities in particular. In Watts, Boyle Heights, which is on the east side of Los Angeles, and in South Central Los Angeles. Each of these communities are traditionally under-resourced, majority low income, majority black and brown, and we've not invested enough in the schools in those communities. So the goal of the partnership is how can we transform the schools within those communities to be the elite schools of all of LA by partnering with parents, by building the capacity of teachers, by building wraparound services that support many of these school sites, and by getting more dollars into these schools as well. My role is overseeing all the work that we're doing around policy and advocacy, family and community engagement, wraparound service and supports, communications, you name it, and excited to do it.
So let's talk a little bit about some topics that folks here in Nevada are talking about with education, and we'd love to hear your thoughts from the work you've done in California with EdTrust West and now with Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. The first is the topic of educator diversity. With students in the Clark County School District and elsewhere in Nevada, we have more students of color, more students who are English learners. What advice, what takeaways do you have for system-level leaders in terms of looking at the diversity of educators who serve our student population today? What can system-level leaders do to recruit and retain more teachers who look like the students they're serving and teaching?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I think are really important. One, I think for system leaders, we have to think about recruitment differently. We have to think about where we're recruiting students, particularly are we partnering with historically black colleges? Are we partnering with Hispanic serving institutions in order to get more black and Latino students, students within our schools, thinking about teaching differently. The second thing I'll say that is really important is that we don't do enough of priming the field to think in a long-term view about how we get students to be really excited about teaching. So I bring up this anecdote often. I look at many of our academies in California in high schools, and you'll see a law academy, you'll see a medical academy, you'll see maybe a social justice academy, but you don't see a lot of teacher academies. You don't see a lot of educator academies. So there's a question of why aren't we talking to students about becoming teachers? The other thing I think is really important is we need to incentivize our school districts working in partnership with community-based organizations and others to find more candidates for teaching. So there are a lot of people of color and people who have low-income backgrounds who work in the youth development sector, who work with parks and recreations, who work in expanded learning opportunities. And they have a phenomenal track record with youth often, but no one is tapping their collective knowledge to say, hey, you should think about teaching. And I think that is to the detriment of many of our systems. Lastly, we just got to think about our teacher preparation programs and how we work with universities to incentivize students to pick teaching. And to also redesign many of our teacher preparation programs to be more inclusive of students of color.
And on that point, in our education system here in the Clark County School District, there's ongoing work with a new school justice partnership. It's been around for a couple months now. And the idea is to work between the school district and the district attorney's office in partnership with other community organizations to keep students off the school to prison pipeline and instead encourage more restorative practices, more positive behavior intervention and supports for students in schools. From the work that you've done and the research you and your colleagues have done, what are some tips that schools can keep in mind to cultivate a school environment where the focus is more on supporting students in their positive behaviors and supporting a more welcoming and open school culture?
Yeah, a couple of things. So at the partnership, we really believe in restorative practices. We have a whole program dedicated to restorative communities, and we've partnered with many of our community organizations who've been fighting for restorative justice practices for years. So a couple of things that we've learned along the way. One, if you want to move your discipline programs from being reactionary to being proactive and investing in our students' ability to resolve their own conflicts, that is a culture change, an extreme culture change within many of our school communities. So we will have to invest in that shift, and that takes some time. So I know there's some school systems that we tried restorative communities for 2 years and we let it go. Well, you probably need to think about this as being a 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year investment before you see all of the payoffs in the work. But given that we've been working on reactionary discipline issues for decades over decades, that's a short amount of time, and I think one worth the investment. I think the other thing that's really important to recognize is a lot of it's about adult behavior. Even though we think of it as a program connected to student success, our staff members, our teachers, our principals will have to think differently about our students. They'll have to deal with some of the challenges around their belief gaps, around their implicit biases. They'll have to look at the data to see why the disproportionality actually continues and where are the hot spots. Where are the 6 to 7, 8, 10 schools where we're really suspending and expelling students of color? And why is that happening? So interrogating the data is also really important. The other thing I'll say, which I think is really exciting about this program, is I've seen a lot of schools that never worked with community partners begin to build relationships, to think differently about how they don't add to the school to prison pipeline. So thinking about how you're partnering with students and families and communities in order to help with this shift is important too. So I think system leaders can really benefit from thinking in those areas.
And tell us that story of a student who went to a teacher, and the teacher responded in one way, but when that student was sent to the principal's office, this principal was trained in some more of these restorative practices. Tell us that story.
So there was a student in Watts who went to a Watts area middle school, and for 2 days in a row, he didn't come with his backpack. He didn't come with any supplies. He just came to school. And the teacher got incensed. So by the day 2, they said, "You're not prepared. You need to go home. You don't want to be here, and I'm sending you to the principal's office." Well, the principal of this school happened to be trained in restorative practices and understood that context mattered. So she took a break. She had a conversation with this student and said, "Well, why don't you have your book bags? Why don't you have your materials?" And the student said, "Well, truthfully, I have a relative who happens to be a drug addict, and they sold everything in our house, including my books, including my book bag, including everything I had, so I don't have anything to bring." And the principal said, well, why didn't you share this with your teacher? I said, well, the teacher asked me these questions in front of all of my other classmates. I would never say that. And took a pause and said, would you have ever told anyone if I hadn't asked you? And he said, probably not. So it tells you that we need to know our students a little bit better, and that they come with their whole lives to our classrooms. And even though something may look one way, it might be something completely different. And I think restorative practices supports thinking differently about who our students are from kind of a whole child perspective.
And to echo your point earlier, in our community roundtable, you mentioned this distinction between restorative justice, doing a program, but the bigger issue of implementing a restorative community, that culture shift and how that takes time, and the importance of educators believing in the importance of that and then working over a longer period of time to implement that with their school community.
Yeah, so a lot of people refer to the restorative justice campaigns around these practices, and that I think that's important. A lot of our community partners have championed those issues in order to reduce suspensions and expulsions. But when we start to think about implementation, the social justice paradigm around the work, I don't think translates in the way of saying this is the new culture shift for our community. We have to think differently about our practices. So I tend to think about framing this as a restorative practice, restorative community program, and one in that we're investing our resources, investing our time, investing our staff differently in order to support student success. And I think that's really important if we're going to not contribute to the school to prison pipeline in ways that we've seen our other discipline practices do.
Let's also talk about this concept of having courageous conversations. In your time with our Leadership Institute, you chat with our participants about how these conversations are difficult, they're challenging, they can be very hard, but it's important to interrogate the biases, implicit or not, that we and those around us hold, especially for those of us who work in education. What is your advice for educators in creating the space to have those critical, courageous conversations, to talk about race, to talk about class, and to talk about how these influence the system and how the system serves or does not serve students?
Yeah, so Glenn Singleton has done some amazing research on having courageous conversations around race in education, and he's provided resources that are accessible to teachers, as well as research papers on this issue. And I think there's a couple things that resonate. One, to your point, it's hard. These are challenging conversations, particularly because we don't have many tools to talk about issues of race and class. And race is usually the conversation that nobody is having. So creating space to do that is important. And not only is it space like within a week or within a month to have these conversations, but over time, and they need to be safe spaces. So you have to create the psychological safety necessary for people to feel like they can have these conversations. The other thing I think is really important is that we have to address our implicit biases. There's been a lot of research over the last 6 to 7 years around how implicit bias affects and shapes our classrooms and our students' experiences, and that continues to be true. When I took my implicit bias test, I realized that I had biases against older people. Sometimes I hate saying that, but because I know that, I know what to check for in my hiring practices. I know what to check for in the way that I talk to those around me. I know what to check for in actions as a leader that happen day to day. So implicit bias is really about recognizing that over time, we all have different things that feed into who we are, and we have to work against some of those biases that tend to affect people negatively. And that is hard work, and it seems embarrassing. And at times I've seen people cry when they find out what implicit biases they have. But when they work to remedy some of their biases, they begin to see changes not only in themselves but in others in ways that are positive. And there's nothing more important than us doing everything we can to be better people in support of our students. So I'm excited about this work, even if it's challenging work.
It certainly can be challenging, but like you said, there's nothing more important than addressing what we who work in education need to do in order to better serve our students. See, Ryan, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.